And we're back for the episode 10 serious Q&A. I've seen reviews of this episode calling it possibly the best, calling the wildfire twist, and saying this was the best season so far. People seem excited about who Arya will kill next. This is completely baffling to me. Are you able to explain these reactions? Well, the season finale was a bit odd. In my opinion, it was the worst episode of Game of Thrones to date, dragging season 6 way below season 5. And yet, so many people are giving it a 10 out of 10 and calling it the best episode they've ever seen. So I've thought about this situation a lot and realized that this whole predicament is Titus Andronicus. Now, in case you don't know, Titus Andronicus was an extremely popular Shakespeare play about the horrors of revenge. The public absolutely loved it, but the critics over the years rank it as Shakespeare's worst play. So what's the main problem with it? Well, the characters are very shallow. We have protagonists and then very, very evil antagonists. But the play is filled with the worst violence imaginable, mostly for shock value. Killing someone's children and feeding it to them in a pie actually comes from Titus Andronicus. Now, as I said, the public loved Titus, but the critics and scholars mostly hated it. But there are some scholars that defend it, saying that the violence does have a point. Shakespeare was trying to show how horrible the cycle of revenge is by taking it to the extreme. Others claim Shakespeare did the whole thing as a farce. After all, there is actually a scene where a woman must deliver a severed hand in her mouth because her own hands have been cut off. Now, I want to hold on to that defense of artistic violence. Artistic violence can be justified as long as it's for the greater purpose of teaching society not to be that violent. For example, Schindler's List is a very violent movie, but it serves a greater purpose. But of course, if Shakespeare did intend Titus to teach nonviolence, he mostly failed on that front. The masses didn't love the play because it had a moral lesson. They loved it for the same reason that people like the Saw movies. It was shock and torture porn. The theater goers went home, didn't think about the lesson, and went on being violent fucks. Now let's bring this back to the last episode. We have the mass incineration of hundreds of people. We have a brutal stabbing done by children. We have an undead monster repeatedly raping a nun. We have the killing of someone's sons and the feeding of them to him in a pie. And we have the delivery of nuclear weapons to Westeros. It's nothing but violence and death and violence and death and violence and death, and the masses fucking love it. Titus Andronicus. So now let's go back to the defense of artistic violence. Do D&D get it? Do they understand that this is supposed to be an anti-war, anti-revenge tale? Is all of this violence supposed to have a greater purpose? Because A Song of Ice and Fire is 100% an anti-war tale. Did anyone get a sense in the last episode that war was a bad thing? Did we see any burn victims? Did we see any mourning? Even Olenna Tyrell seemed pretty good considering she lost her whole family. Cersei barely mourned Tommen, and no one mourned Rickon. And besides Walder Frey, all the death we saw was either abstract or cartoonish. I'm just not sure if D&D do get it. I mean, the Septon Ray character before made me think that perhaps they did. But then again, maybe they just adapted Maribald and the Elder Brother and didn't think about it that much. When Varys used the Fire and Blood line, did they understand it was from Doran, a very misguided character, or did they just think it sounded cool? On the one hand, in the Inside the Episode for episode 10, David Benioff did say that Arya's actions were a little troubling. A little troubling. But on the other hand, in the Inside the Episode for episode 9, D.B. Weiss said that having Ramsay eaten by dogs was a rare moment that they were giving a character happiness. He didn't mention at all how disturbing it should be. So I just don't know. You would think that the pie and the piles of bodies in the Battle of the Bastards episode would be a big revenge is bad, war is bad signal. But then again, dragons somehow brought democracy to Meereen, and those body piles just made the Northerners shove their dicks in the air again and vote for more fighting. So I don't know, maybe D&D know exactly what they're doing. Or maybe it's torture porn. Or maybe it's farce. Where do you think Sam's plot is going? He arrived at the Citadel, but there's no way he can become a maester before it all ends, both in book and in the series. In a general sense, I see the Sam plot as being parallel to the Bran plot. George R. R. Martin has an obsession with the all-powerful shut-in. It's a type of character that appears often in his work. These are characters that can massively change the world sitting in their chairs at home, like chess players behind a board. Think about what the Werewood Net is and Bran's powers versus what the Citadel is and Sam's powers. The Werewood Net is a place where knowledge collects, and Bran is able to use the trees to talk to people around the world and peer into their dreams. And now look at Sam in the Citadel. He has access to a massive library where knowledge collects, and with a glass candle, he can talk to people around the world and peer into their dreams. Now also in the book, Sam's plotline has so many other things going on. It's the plotline I've been most eager to know about. Euron is attacking, there's the Maester conspiracy, the Brave Companions are there, the Faceless Men are there, there's the Dornish Master Plan and the Tyrell Master Plan, and the mysterious Hightowers. It all makes me giddy just to think about it. Now there's no way the show is going to adapt that much of it. I'm simply hoping that Sorella Sand and Marwyn show up. Speaking of lines of succession, who should have actually succeeded Tommen by law? Apparently there are no trueborn Baratheons left. So one major theme of the books is that inheritance isn't cut and dry, and there will always be disputes. And this is somewhat true of the real Middle Ages. Laws varied from place to place if there were laws at all, and we didn't have teams of lawyers to figure everything out for us. So here in the show, it's not that I have a problem with Cersei making a claim, it's that no one else is making a claim, and that Cersei isn't immediately getting married. This is feudalism, and the Lannisters are not a strong house right now, and Cersei is a woman, and the people should hate Cersei for essentially destroying the equivalent of the Vatican or the Sacred Mosque. Where are the other claimants? So in the books, the Lady Hornwood conflict from A Clash of Kings is a pretty good example of what happens when there's no clear heir, as is the House Rosby conflict from A Feast for Crows. We are presented with a number of possible ideas on what to do when there's no clear heir. Cousins, in-laws, bastards, and wards are all considered. And marriages are also immediately considered as a point of compromise. So who is Tommen's heir? Well, we simply don't know. Renly, Stannis, and Shireen are all dead, so we would naturally search for another Baratheon. If there are no other Baratheons, we could look to Robert's mother's house, House Estermont. If there are no Estermonts around, we could look to his paternal grandmother's house, House Targaryen. Keep in mind, Robert was considered a good choice for the Iron Throne in the first place because his paternal grandmother was R+L Targaryen. Of course, there are no Targaryens really around, so we could look to his maternal grandfather, who is unknown, or R+L Targaryen's mother's house, which is Blackwood. You can play around in these succession charts for a while, there's no right or wrong answer. And that's kind of the point, you can go to many places for a claimant. We just don't know who these characters are. Gendry could also make a claim being a bastard, or any wards of the throne if they exist. And yes, Cersei could try to make a claim, though lords do like stability and Cersei has no heir. Now there is another complication. There was a great council in the year 101 that put preference for male line claims for the Iron Throne over female line claims. Although this is not completely applicable, it does show that the Lords of Westeros are sexist and prefer to look to male house lines and men in general as their rulers. Cersei's claim would be a long shot. I would say that in all likelihood, a Baratheon, Estermont, or Blackwood should be crowned, the first two houses being rather important to secure the Stormlands. If Cersei were a bit younger, they could marry her to the new king and hope to produce a new heir. However, even in the book, Cersei is getting old. In all likelihood, the new king would marry a girl capable of producing an heir, like Kevin's daughter Janae. So that's my answer, a random Baratheon or Estermont married to Janae Lannister. That, or a Great Council would be called. But yeah, not Cersei. That would be ridiculous. Who supports Cersei's claim to the Iron Throne? That's a good question, and there isn't a good answer. Really, no one should. The Tyrells have a superior army that was in the city just a few episodes ago, so realistically, they should have taken the city and killed Cersei and Qyburn. And really, if not the Tyrells, riots and furious citizens should have strung up Cersei for destroying the Sept. And on top of that, the Tyrells control the food source for King's Landing. Really, there should be bread riots as well. But if I had to make an argument and we have a best case scenario for Cersei, it would be that off-screen the High Sparrow had requested the Tyrell army to head home to Highgarden, and that Jaime returned to King's Landing at just the right time to secure the city and maintain order. We would have to assume that Jaime's return and Olenna and Dorne are scenes out of order. And so anyway, this is still our best case scenario. Somehow the Riverlands had a bountiful harvest, and now the food stores are full for winter. And many of the houses are still in disarray from the War of the Five Kings and are just supporting Cersei as a default. And best case scenario, because it's been a fair bit of time since the War of the Five Kings, maybe 4 years, that a lot of the kids that were not old enough to fight then are now old enough to fight. And so maybe Casterly Rock has assembled a new host, and the Freys have all the soldiers from the Twins and Riverrun. And why not Harrenhal too? Littlefinger's been gone for years. Still, even giving Cersei all of that, I still couldn't see the combined Riverland, Westerman, and Stormland armies being any match for Dany. Even if Cersei gets Euron, that doesn't change things very much. I guess Cersei could also hope that maybe a slaver city or the anti-dragon city of Braavos would help her. But in reality, the only thing that would save Cersei is the Dany coalition falling apart and turning on itself. Do you see the show using R+L = J and the books using R+L = D? I mean, I never believed that the show would be able to follow the same path as the books, but something this drastic? Well, certainly the show's reveal is another piece of evidence in favor of R+L=J for the books, but nothing is confirmed yet, and George R. Martin can, of course, do anything he wants and change his mind. The show certainly left open the possibility of twinsies, just as they left open the possibility of Stannis being alive. Now, it turns out I guessed wrong and Stannis wasn't alive, but it's hard to deny that they hadn't purposely left themselves the option just in case Winds of Winter came out and Stannis played an essential role. The show put a mystery woman in the room just in case they need her to be important later. Will she be used? Who knows? But for the books, do I still believe R+L=D? Sure, maybe less, but yeah. The show rarely talked about Brandon Stark or Ashara Dane, so really R+L=J was their only option. But for the book, something is definitely wrong with Dany's memories, and Ned has a connection to Dany somehow. And Ashara Dane and Starfall are still a complete mystery. Maybe R+L=D? Maybe Dany is Ashara's? It's hard to say. I think a lot of people assume I'm really emotionally invested in R+L because they are, but truth be told, I've never liked any of the lineage talk. Some comments have called me a book snob who never criticizes the book and always criticizes the show. Okay, real talk. Here's some book criticism. The lineage talk is stupid. The book pushes heavily that the differentiation between highborn and lowborn is prejudicial and evil, but then it turns around and makes lineage this central mystery that will change everything. Personally, I think it undermines the Jon character. I mean, Jon's whole identity is that of a bastard who has to make it on his own. Finding out he's secretly king kind of spoils that. I mean, imagine if Kunta Kinte from Roots suddenly discovered that he was a white slave master the whole time. Would it make him a better slave master? Sure, I guess. He might be the kindest, most enlightened slave master in the world, but it doesn't change the fact that the whole practice of slavery is an abomination and needs to end. Jon can discover he's secretly a king, or, as in the show, become a king, but fundamentally, the whole practice of monarchy and feudalism is an abomination and needs to end. So can Dany's 3 dragons make the flight all the way to Westeros? I mean, without stopping. If not, where exactly is she planning on letting them land to rest, and what exactly are they going to feed them? Well, because this is a time before sextants, ships rarely go very far from shore. So I don't think the dragons will have too much trouble eating fish or farmers' sheep and resting on nearby land. For the book, though, I do wonder if Valyria is safe for them to linger in. Now, Dany's fleet is a much bigger challenge. In the book, the Ironborn specifically talk about how the movement of such a huge fleet is perilous. Storms scatter them, ports only have room for a certain number of ships, and some ports are politically hostile. Now, Dany does have dragons, so I suppose she can threaten Volantis to let her fleet come in and get food and fresh water. And I suppose Volantis would be happy to simply let Dany get out of Essos, where she's causing trouble. So Dany's trip is logistically difficult, but certainly not impossible. Should we assume that the explosion of the Great Sept of Baelor will be in the books? I think it was inspired by the gunpowder plot. If so, isn't borrowing from English history like that more a George move? For those that don't know, the gunpowder plot was a failed attempt to blow up the House of Lords in 1605. Now, as for blowing up the Great Sept of Baelor, the problem is, in the books, that's the one place we know wildfire isn't. Aerys put caches of wildfire all over the city, and many are lost, but a previous High Septon found the cache underneath the Great Sept. If the wildfire in the books is going to go off, it'll probably be a different location or the entire city. Though I suppose Cersei could just have the pyromancers make more. Now, if it is based on the gunpowder plot, it's important to note that the gunpowder wouldn't have just taken out the House of Lords. It would have killed everyone in a 100-meter radius and seriously harmed people in a 200-meter radius. So there's definitely this idea of doing more harm than one planned. I could see someone accidentally taking out the whole city. What is more disappointing, not learning Marjorie's plan or not figuring out the High Sparrow's motivations? This is a tough one. With regard to the High Sparrow, the book fan in me was looking for spoilers and wanted to find out if the High Sparrow was anyone special. I'm intrigued by the Sparrow movement in the book mainly because Book Oberyn had the foresight to have Tyene Sand trained in the faith, and because Doran felt that Arianna should read up on the lives of the High Septons. Now maybe those are just big coincidences, but the Dornish seemed to know that the Sparrow movement was coming. Now, from the show's perspective, they spent so much time on the High Sparrow's sermons with weird contradictory elements. I really wanted to see who this man was and what he wanted. Did he believe his sermons? Is he simply a charlatan? Why has he taken such a hardline approach to religion? What was his endgame? But in the end, there was nothing. The contradictions in his sermons were likely errors in writing, and there was never likely an endgame. I guess his motivation was that he was just a true zealot and wanted his form of justice. But in the end, I would say the Marjorie story is a bit more disappointing. She was definitely supposed to have a plan. Marjorie appeared to be matching the Sparrow move for move, and seemed to be legitimately fooling the High Sparrow into thinking that she had converted. Her note to Alina was a promising message telling her to trust her. So yeah, I had some expectations, which were dashed. I suppose Marjorie's plan must have been get Loras out and then go to war and kill all the Sparrows. And I suppose she felt she had more control over Tommen than Cersei did. If that was her plan, it's not much of a plan. Do you believe the assertion that Cersei really loves her children? I never got that impression, especially in the books. I think Cersei only cares about Cersei, and her children are the key to her power and position. That's a really good question. So one huge difference between the book and the show is how Cersei feels about her children. Show Cersei is an ardent defender of her children who is devastated when 2 of her children die and is slightly upset when the 3rd one does. And the showrunners have said this many times in interviews. Everything Cersei does is for them. Until this last episode where they suddenly made Cersei into a different person who does things because they feel good, apparently. Now Cersei in the books is very different. I mean, she seems to like her kids, certainly more than Jaime does, who doesn't care 2 figs about them, but she doesn't think about her children as much as you'd think she would compared to her show counterpart. I would say though that book Cersei is fond of Joffrey, or at least as fond as Cersei can be of anyone. She reflects on Joffrey as beautiful and fierce, and she reflects on how painful his death was. Now Cersei rarely thinks about Myrcella at all, which is kind of perplexing. And then there's Tommen. Well, Cersei certainly wants to keep Tommen safe from Marjorie. But for what purpose? Because she loves Tommen? Because she wants to stop the Maggie the Frog prophecy? Or because Tommen is her key to power? I actually think it's a bit of all 3 with Tommen. During Cersei's Walk of Shame, she repeatedly thinks about wanting to get home to Tommen, her little king. But she also thinks that Tommen will do as he's told. A very mysterious line in the book is, Tommen, her precious little boy, had named her champion to the Kingsguard. Is Tommen precious because Tommen is her son, or is he precious because he's the only thing keeping Cersei alive? Now with Joffrey, Cersei couldn't control him, so I must assume her love for him was pure and real. Or perhaps she saw more of herself in Joffrey. But Cersei's love for Tommen is very different and a bit mixed up, so I think the nature of Cersei's love for Tommen is one thing to keep an eye out for in the Winds of Winter. Can't Jon just legitimize himself now that he's king in the North? So the taint of bastardy can be removed by royal decree. This is true. So yes, Jon can certainly remove the taint of bastardy from himself. That said, I'm not sure how much use there would be for it. So the big thing about being a bastard is you cannot inherit. Bastards can own land like anyone else, but they cannot inherit lands. So in this situation, Jon is not inheriting. He is simply being declared king. And historically, there have been bastard kings, most notably William the Conqueror. Now, perhaps Jon just wants to remove the taint of bastardy for reputation reasons. Now, that move might help a little, but according to the old gods and the new, legitimized bastards are still shameful and still considered untrustworthy. Ramsay Bolton was still looked down upon for being a bastard even after legitimization, as was Adam of Hull and Daemon Blackfyre. According to religion, the bad nature is in the blood because they were conceived through sinful passion and not legitimate marriage. Now, I suppose it could be useful for Jon to legitimize himself so he can steal Sansa's land. I will say that the whole thing is confusing, as right now Sansa is Lady of Winterfell. So when Jon was made king, did he steal Sansa's fief? Or was a new house created, say House White Wolf? And if House White Wolf was created, what's his fief? And say Jon does remove his own bastardy. Does he rejoin House Stark? Because if he rejoins House Stark, legitimized children might go behind trueborn children, and so Winterfell would once again go to Sansa. It's all dizzying and actually ambiguous in the book. Kat seems to think that legitimized bastards would go ahead of trueborns in the north, while Roose Bolton seems to think that legitimized bastards would go behind trueborns in the north. So who knows, I doubt the show will go into this in detail. Jon is probably just Jon Stark, King of Winterfell, and Sansa is probably now his heir, Princess of Winterfell. And that's all for now. See you guys at the unserious Q&A. Put your craziest and funniest questions about Season 6 in the comments and I'll try to pick out the best ones. And I'll see you next time.